we almost do treat our scientists sort of like godly figures. But the truth is that like what we can report or what we know is such a small fraction of the entire data.
Hi, humans!
Welcome to Demystifying Science.
Another excellent episode of the Galactic Alliance.
So, who are we talking to today, Quinn?
We have two college students, Rich and Maya. They're studying computer science and physics.
They have big questions about morality, religion, and science.
Yeah, they have a podcast. It's called Anonymous Hedgehog. So, everybody watching, go check them out. And let's call them up.
Hey, humans.
Hello, humans.
I'm Micky.
I'm Quinn.
You guys want to tell us a little bit about where you guys are from, your planet, and your show?
Well, we were sent out to your solar system to refuel some drones. And our scientists have been studying you guys for a while. But we're going to bring back updates, and
Well, so
we're not quite there yet.
we've realized that humans have left the solar system. You pinged one of our sensors when your Voyager spacecraft left the heliosphere.
Oh.
And that makes you a very young intergalactic society. And the thing is that for intergalactic societies, there's some rules. And humans seem like they haven't figured out some of these rules.
So what are these rules that you're referring to?
It's really important to understand how things work and how to explain them and what constitutes an explanation.
Yep.
Because
Interesting.
if you don't understand how things work, things get chaotic.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't you tell us, like, we're curious to know, like, what are some of the differences on how these things work and explanations for why things happen the way they do over on your planet Alpha Floss versus over on our planet Earth?
Well, the biggest difference we can see is that science starts with physical objects. So whenever we explain something on our planet, we always got to start with a piece of something that has a shape to it, like an atom on your planet.
And
so we wouldn't just talk about different concepts like love and hate crashing into each other in science. We would have to use physical objects.
That's interesting.
So it seems like you guys have a more objective point of view on how the universe works, but here on Earth, I think we use things like religion to back up our views even more than science. How do you guys feel about that?
Well, it's cool. We just talked to a scholar of poetry from your planet. And we like human music a lot. We jam out to it a lot. We like your poets. So we think it's interesting.
there's a difference between science and religion, fundamentally, which is the fact that religion can offer solutions to questions of meaning, something that's larger than ourselves, something that can't be seen. It deals with faith.
Meaning.
It deals with psychology and spirit. And we have religion on Alpha Floss. There's stories that we tell about ourselves and our past, things that happened a really long time ago that no one was around to see. But we separate that from our science because science can't be based on faith.
Can't have biases.
I think the concept that you talk about, sort of just the morality and the meaning behind things versus the science behind things, it's kind of an interesting concept that and I know a lot of people on Earth kind of struggle with this, is that without without religion, I know a lot of atheists would probably say differently, but a lot of people believe that without religion, there's almost no value system in which to judge your actions. So, for example, I know that you talked about this in a separate episode, which is just like, yeah, so like without religion, how do we know not to go pollute this lake so that we can build our factory, right? So like without an objective moral system, right? So like what in science would tell you that is wrong? And so do you guys sort of base your moral system off of something similar over on Alpha Floss, or do you guys have a different way of thinking about things?
Well, it's cool because science could teach you that polluting that lake is going to lead to a dead end for your species.
But I guess that is, I guess it's like almost, why is a dead end to our species objectively something that we want to prevent? So, for example, because I assume presumably when the dead end to our species occurs, I will not be here, so it won't affect me personally. So it's almost like, why does that even matter?
So,
Mickey, you got something?
well, I think we got to slow down and define what morality is. Because for us, morality is a matter of consent. So if you do something that violates my consent, that's immoral. So we see the future generations as being subject to our actions. So if we do things that mess up their world, we're violating their consent across the ages.
Because
That's
they don't have a
intriguing
seat
because-
at the table. And presumably, they have a desire to be born. They have a desire to have the right to exist.
They just don't have a voice right now. They're sort of underrepresented.
So it seems like morality on your planet is very interdependent between aliens. It's based on how you're interacting with others. Whereas on Earth, I feel like morality seems to stem from it. So even if I was to live on an isolated planet with just me, and my actions cannot harm or help anybody else because there's no one else on the planet, I feel like there would still be a moral code that I would need to be living by that doesn't have to do with anyone else. Whereas I feel like on your planet, it seems to be, if my decision hurts XYZ, then my decision is either moral or immoral. And to add on to that, I think our planet, religion and science are not mutually exclusive. Almost as if they're so interconnected that in order to justify religion, we use science, and in order to justify science, we use religion. Whereas on your planet, they seem so mutually exclusive that they're almost two completely different branches used for two completely different purposes.
I will say that on our planet, we tend to have a pretty strong separation between things. We separate our scientists and our engineers. We separate our religion from our science because these things have different purposes.
Conflicts of interest.
And you want to minimize conflicts of interest, right? Because when you put everything in a single pile and don't have a good way of weighing what something is worth or figuring out how to balance its voice, then you run into problems. I see this on Earth a lot where you run into the problems of, like Maya said, the question of why is it immoral to pollute a lake? And the fact is that if you're alone on a planet and there's nobody there, do you mean no other life forms?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you could live on that planet. I don't think you could make decisions on that planet. You too would die.
I mean, I guess you would die eventually, but it's almost like, yeah, that's true. I guess it would be impossible to just kind of live in a desolate land by yourself. But I guess it's almost just a sort of thought experiment. just like, if you were to live just completely no other life forms, does morality exist in that space that only has you when you're not affecting other people around you?
I would challenge the idea that you even could ask that question and have it be useful. Because life is interdependent. If you are alive, there are other creatures that you depend on. It might be plants if you're a vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
It could be fish if you eat fish. There's always something that you eat. You can look at a plant and you can say, well, the plant doesn't depend on anyone. But that's not true either. The plant depends on bacteria, on worms, on other plants even.
So I guess my question would be then, so bringing up the concept of kind of plants and animals and their interdependence, how do you weigh those objective, or how do you weigh kind of the relative morals between those? Like, how do you decide that, for example, like the well-being of your alien species is more important than the well-being of plants or something, for example? Like, how do you kind of sort those things into levels of like which one is more important and decide which one to prioritize in your society? Because you do have to kind of take one at the cost of another.
Well, we have courts just like you guys, but it really comes down to a fundamental difference in that you humans see yourselves as separate from your environment.
Mm-hmm.
But you couldn't exist without that plant outside of your house. So, for us,
it's diversity.
There's many orders of effects, and they all count.
You have to have a diverse ecosystem.
So do you view like your own species as just as valuable as the plant outside, for example?
Yes, of course.
Yep.
That's interesting.
It's necessary to create a system where all living... Well, let me take a step back. It's hard to look at things from the standpoint of top-down. Necessary to create is a little godly, in my view.
Uh-huh.
I think that survival comes down to working well with others.
So I guess it's like, so for example, then, well, I guess how do you guys, because over here not everyone does, well, I guess everyone does eat. So like for us humans to survive, we need to consume other living things. So like how do you guys determine over on Alpha Floss when it's okay to kind of consume or use other living things for your own benefit if you see yourself as just as valuable as another living organism?
Well, I eat worms, personally.
Gross.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I grow my own worms, though, here on the spaceship.
He treats
it
them
can
well.
get kind of messy.
It's disgusting.
Quinn doesn't like it. Quinn eats radioactive rocks, which is a whole different matter.
They don't have a lot of feelings.
Yeah.
That's interesting that you bring up feelings, because it kind of begs the question, what develops our worth? And if it's feelings that develop our worth, then it's very easy to create that top-down system that we were talking about earlier, where we can create a hierarchy. What has a higher moral value versus what has no moral value. And based on that, we can choose, okay, well, for my survival, I should eat the objects with the least moral value. But the question is, like, is emotion even a good enough indicator of whether or not something has value? Who are we to decide as emotional life beings that emotion is the most valuable a part of a life form? Because to me, that seems biased. We happen to have a lot of emotion, and thus we create the rubric of, oh, if you have emotion, you are valuable. But to another life form that doesn't have as much emotion, something else that we don't have might be just as valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of adding on to what Rich just said, it's like you mentioned radioactive rocks, right? And well, at least like we consider rocks to be non-living things. And it's interesting because you brought up feelings, and we're just talking about this too. It's just like, how do you guys even determine like why living things are more valuable than non-living things, or are they even more valuable?
Well, I don't think we'd say they're more valuable. Depends. This word values, we define morality in terms of other beings. So it's all about consent for us, really.
If I was to eat all of the radioactive rocks and all of the other creatures that needed radioactive rocks didn't have radioactive rocks, then we would run into problems.
There'd be some moral issues there.
So what about things like radioactive rocks that, like, by definition, I guess, don't give consent? So, like, would you be, by eating, like, not even taking a food source from other organisms, but just by eating the rocks themselves, is that in and of itself sort of an immorality? Because the radioactive rocks, they can't possibly give consent.
Well, that makes them a great food source for Quinn. But here's the thing with morality. There's no perfection. So oftentimes there's going to be conflicts of interest.
Perfection is the enemy of progress.
Perfection is the enemy of progress. So you guys have courts on your planet. We have similar courts to negotiate these conflicts of interest. But there's going to come times where we need to minimize the violation of consent. And it won't be possible, as in the case of my species survival, where we all eat worms. We're really trying to minimize the moral infractions. So we focus on giving our worms a good life.
So I wonder, why is consent your kind of standard? So, like, what is so special about or important about consent that you use that kind of to determine all of your moral system?
Our moral system requires a balance between the individual and the collective. And consent is the mechanism by which you ensure that the individual is not overrun by the collective. And there are many ways.
That was very well said.
Oh, go ahead.
I think that was very well said, and I think honestly our moral system can learn from that, because regarding consent, I feel like on Alvafloss, the system is interspecies. So it's consent between the people on Alvafloss and the life form that exists on Alvafloss. Whereas on Earth, not consent between two humans, it's consent between a human and faith, the God that they believe in. It's not whether or not my action harms person ABC. It's whether or not my action will be approved by the God that I believe in. And I think that brings about a bunch of ambiguities, because the God that I believe in may be different from the God that person B believes in, creating this sort of dichotomy between whether or not the consent is actually being respected. Whereas if we had just adopted your system, where there's just an objective system of consent between two species, and there's no third party of thinking about whether or not God approves of the consent, I feel like that would be a lot simpler to keep track of with less moral ambiguity.
Yeah.
It's a hard system to get to.
Spread it around, Rich.
You have to develop it by trial and error. Alvafloss wasn't always a great place. We have the benefit of living for a long time. Alvaflossians live for thousands of years. And so that gives us the opportunity to really look at the consequences of our actions and to really start to integrate how things change. It's this sort of long lifespan that's allowed us to realize that we're not the only intelligent beings on a planet, and has allowed us to create, I think, what you would call a religious framework that's centered on nature. There are consequences. Oh,
yeah,
go
sorry.
ahead.
No, I mean, it's interesting that you kind of talk about the lifespan of your society and how ours is, like you said in the very beginning, a very, very young intergalactic society. So I think it's interesting, and you also pointed out that perfection is an obstacle to progress, and I would very much agree. So, like, would you say that your moral system, like, is there any imperfections that you can point out that you think that it would take, even longer to kind of sort through?
There are mistakes that we make all the time. It is a constant process of making mistakes. There is never perfection.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is to find ways that allow you to address your mistakes.
Move in the right direction.
Our society functions well because we have systems in place for soliciting criticisms. We have institutions on the planet that have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and they're constantly interrogated by the Alba Flossian people and by the other intelligent beings on the planet, where we are allowed to enter into conversation and discuss their failings. Nothing is sacred. There's no such thing as a perfect institution. And so we have more mistakes than we can count, and some of them are terrible. Some of them lead to great suffering.
So I think Rich really brought up a good point with the idea of religion requiring an intermediary. And there's a lot of freedom and power in rationalizing something like morality, because then every single individual can understand through their own mind what is good and what is bad. And otherwise, you run the risk of the meanest, nastiest ruler developing a god to enact their own wishes, which can't really be understood by definition.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's like, I think that our moral system on Earth, like you said, it requires an intermediary. And also it's like we have these things like priests are like people who kind of serve as the interpreter of gods. And it's almost like you can never, like, the common man who believes in certain religion, it's like it's almost difficult for them to really understand what God's word is. And they had this whole problem, I think, was in the Catholic Church, which is just like, people weren't actually reading the Bible. They were just taking, their pastor, their priest's word for it. And it wasn't actually what their God meant. And so religion itself is so subjective, like you were saying.
And subject to subversion by those priests.
This is one of the dangers on Earth that I've observed in my readings, where oftentimes I will read a scientific paper that one of your Earth scientists has written. And it's difficult to understand. It's obfuscated. It is
Clear as mud.
Clear as mud is good. Did you pick that up from them?
Been watching some Netflix.
Very good. So it's clear as mud, and I feel like there's this relationship between science and religion, like Rich said earlier, that might even be making priests of the scientists. Because these are texts that cannot be interpreted.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up sort of this almost purposeful misinterpretation of not only just religious texts, but scientific texts and paper. You see this a lot with scientific papers in our area. I've involved a little bit in the research sphere, and it happens a lot in academia, where very simple experiment is conducted. And in order to report the experiment, a 20-page PDF research paper is let out with the most obfuscated title. That sole purpose is to make the experiment seem as though it was more than it actually was. And honestly, rather than advancing the field of science, it almost does the opposite, because people struggle to understand the experiment. And I think the same happens with religion, with priests and pastors trying to complicate the word of God, or the word that's written in a scripture, in order to make the moral system seem more confusing than it actually is.
And
When
to
in
justify the
reality-
mediator.
Oh, and to justify the mediator. When in reality, the only thing that might really matter is the whole consent factor that you guys threw in.
And for science, the understanding. You have to have understanding. That's all that matters.
Yeah, I guess on Earth, like our understanding of something that we see, I would say science on Earth even is pretty objective, but like you pointed out, like our understanding of science is so subjective. Like the numbers, like people say, like the numbers don't lie. That's true, but there's just so much fluff in between on all these research papers to get to the numbers that the common man doesn't have the time or the energy to go through all of that. So we rely on things like we rely on news articles, we rely on reporters, we rely on all these things to kind of serve as that intermediary. And it justifies, like people make their entire living off of doing that. Like you have to justify the mediator in there.
It's interesting that you say the numbers don't lie, because I think that many people on Earth think that. The problem is, though, that the numbers are just a little window onto what's actually there. You do an experiment and you can measure something. And you can make conclusions off of those numbers. But there's a lot of certainty that goes into the way that these findings are reported. There's not much attention paid to the fact that no scientific study can collect all of the numbers. How could you? Even if it's really small. You've tested a teeny, tiny, little fraction of what's actually there. And instead of reporting it from the perspective of this is a fraction of what we might know, there's a tendency of saying, well, the numbers don't lie. But if they're
also,
Go ahead.
I just want to point out that you and I can look at some numbers and we can come up with two totally different theories for what they represent.
We spend a lot of time arguing.
So,
Yeah, exactly. I think that it's interesting that what I mean when I say the numbers don't lie, it's like the data is what it is. But I think you're talking about more of the conclusions that we draw, which I would agree. Like the conclusions, like I could look at a data set and just completely and we could draw two completely different conclusions. And I would say that is true. But when I say, I guess the numbers don't lie, I mean, it's just like the data is what it is. And I think, Quinn, what you were saying is very true. It's like these scientific studies, we almost do treat our scientists sort of like godly figures in that they have an ability to, be kind of this all-knowing. Like I conduct a study and then I take the findings of the study and I report it with so much certainty. But the truth is that like, it's so what we can report or what we know is such a small fraction of the entire data that exists out in the universe.
it brings up a bigger question too, which is the job of the scientist to describe what they see, or is it to look at what they see, describe it, and then explain the cause of it? Because numbers can describe all day long, but numbers can never, ever explain something.
That brings up a really good point about interpretation. Because when we talk about interpretation here on Earth, all of us have our own individual interpretations based on the experiences we've collected throughout our very short lifespans. And seeing these individual numbers may constrict or expand our interpretation based on how they are displayed to us. If the numbers come along with an explanation, our interpretation is constrained. Versus if the numbers come along with nothing but just the numbers, we're left to our own experiences in order to draw these relevant conclusions. And honestly, I don't know which one is better, because The first option, coming with a conclusion, gives us the opportunity to focus on the origin and question whether or not the explanation given to us is accurate and whether or not we agree. Whereas the second explanation gives us more room for error, because chances are our experiences aren't lined up with the experiences of the scientists who spent and dedicated their lives towards analyzing these numbers. And so there's pros and cons to both, and it's really intriguing to try to ask, what do you guys do on your planet? Do you guys prefer just giving the numbers to your population, or do you prefer to give your numbers with an explanation and a subjective view of how and why those numbers are relevant?
Well, here's the thing. Science is always trying to explain something that you don't have all the pieces of the movie. So science, a theory, is a movie for what happened. You know, say I drop a ball on your planet and it flies towards the ground, right? We have to explain what caused the ball to go to the ground. But the fact of the matter is we don't have all the parts of the story. Your microscopes can't look small enough to actually see what the atoms are doing. So you have to come up with some kind of a theory for what's happening. Just describing, if you just describe how that the ball went to the ground and that it does it in a certain mathematical fashion, you still haven't explained why the ball went to the ground. You've just described it. So we would start with that. We would start with that description. That's where we start. But we're going to move towards possible explanations. Not certain explanations, but we're going to come up with theories, which are possibilities for what could be happening.
I think that's so interesting that you bring up the ball falling to the ground example, because that almost begs like the explanation that sort of the conclusion almost has to precede the data itself, or like a possible conclusion. Because here on Earth, when kids are very young, they learn this thing called the scientific method, in which you first have to have a scientific question and a hypothesis, and then you either prove or you disprove your hypothesis. So it's almost like you can't do research in and of itself without kind of having a conclusion in mind. So like we can't discover, or like we can't explain really gravity outside of, you know, the ball falling to the ground. And the same is when I conduct a statistical research paper. My goal of that research, I had an end goal in mind when I started it, right? Like I couldn't have collected that data without having an end goal in mind.
Yeah, so we call that the engineering method on our planet, because we are trying to build something, and we're really concerned with describing it in a parametricized way.
And it's really effective for that.
Really effective for engineering.
It gets you places.
Helps you build stuff.
It's why humans have managed to build so much in the last 100 years, 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little different from what humans used to do, which is sort of closer to natural philosophy, which is to look at the world and to attempt to explain not something that you have concluded beforehand, but something that you look at the world and then you speak to it. And this is something that comes back to what Rich was asking about the value of interpretation versus the value of presentation.
That's a very thought-provoking question that we can end off on. So I think that's just an interesting, and that's going to keep me up at night. But It was very, very great discussing this with you. And honestly, the topics that we covered were so intriguing. I'm so glad that we were able to make this intergalactic communication possible. Before we go, I'd just like to say I'm Rich, and this is Maya from the Anonymous Hedgehog. Our podcast is meant to question things and basically analyze them from a philosophical viewpoint. And demystifying science, if you want to say something about yourselves before we wrap up.
We'll be here. Hit us up. Demystify Sci everywhere on your interwebs, on Earth.
We have a good internet presence
We love to
for
talk.
being intergalactic. you know.
Yeah.
You sure do. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, and see you all next time.
Sure.
Thanks, Rich and Maya.
Bye.
Bye.